The city of Kamino Ward had barely finished rebuilding when the sky split open. It wasn't a villain attack, at least, not one any sensor array could classify. No Quirk signature preceded it, no warp gate shimmer, no gravitational distortion that Hawk's instruments could identify from his altitude. One moment the air above the coastal highway was clear, salt-tinged and humming with evening traffic. The next, reality itself seemed to flinch. A sound like tearing fabric amplified to the scale of a thunderclap, and something fell from the wound in the atmosphere like a stone dropped from heaven. Endeavor saw it from 3 kilometers away. He was midway through an aerial patrol sweep, flame jets carrying him in a slow arc above the waterfront district, when the rupture flared on the horizon. His hero instincts processed the situation before conscious thought caught up. Unidentified falling object, high velocity, populated civilian zone below, response time approximately 11 seconds. He was already burning hard toward the impact point before his comm unit crackled with Hawk's voice. "You seeing this, Endeavor?" "Moving," he said. Nothing else needed saying. She hit the highway median at terminal velocity. The asphalt cratered. Not exploded. Cratered, like something had pressed a fist into wet clay, a perfectly circular depression 2 meters across and half a meter deep. Civilian vehicles swerved, tires screaming, 2 cars clipping the guardrail in the chaos. A delivery truck jackknifed across 2 lanes. Endeavor came down hard 50 meters back, landing in a controlled burn that scorched the road surface black, and got his first look at what had fallen. A girl. She stood in the center of the crater as though she'd simply decided to be there. Pink hair, or perhaps it only appeared pink in the dying light, matted and wild around a face that belonged to someone in their late teens. She wore almost nothing, a tattered remnant of what might once have been a clinical gown, pale fabric gray with filth and dark with old blood. But it was her head that made Endeavor's fire instinctively dim. Horns. 2 short, blunted horns emerging from her skull just above her temples, perfectly symmetrical, unmistakably biological. He'd seen stranger Quirk manifestations. He told himself that immediately. Horns weren't unusual, Quirks had produced scales, tails, wings, compound eyes. Horns were nothing. What made his combat instincts fire at full alert wasn't the horns. It was the radius around her. Within approximately 4 meters of where she stood, everything was wrong. The asphalt surface was scored with cuts too precise and too numerous to count, a crosshatch of incisions that went centimeters deep into solid road surface. The guardrail to her left had been sliced into 7 separate segments, each cut clean as a laser. A hubcap from one of the swerving vehicles lay in 4 neat pieces. A traffic sign post had been severed at its base and toppled silently into the crash barrier. She hadn't moved. Her hands hung at her sides. Her eyes, a deep, unsettling red, tracked Endeavor with the flat, assessing calm of something that had looked at apex predators before and found them wanting. "Hero Society," she said. The words were Japanese but the cadence was wrong, too deliberate, like someone accessing a language from memory rather than instinct. "You have heroes here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't relief, either. Endeavor kept his distance. 11 years as the number 2 hero, and now number 1, had built instincts he trusted more than sensor readings, and every one of them was screaming that the 4-meter radius around this girl was a kill zone he should not enter. "I'm Endeavor. Pro hero, number 1 ranked. Identify yourself and your quirk." Her head tilted slightly. "Quirk. The ability you're using. The cutting." He kept his voice level, professionally neutral, the tone he'd learned to deploy. In situations where fire first and classify later would create more problems than it solved. Declare it and stand down. No one needs to get hurt. Something moved across her face, not quite amusement, not quite contempt. Something older and more tired than either. "You can't see them," she said, almost to herself. "Interesting. In my world, the military could at least detect the vectors. Her red eyes refocused on him. Invisible arms. I have many of them. They extend roughly 2 meters in each direction. A pause. I've already killed 31 people today. I don't know what world this is or how I arrived here. I'm telling you this so you understand the situation accurately. 31. Endeavor's jaw set. Behind him, he could hear civilian evacuation beginning. Hawks was already up there somewhere, coordinating crowd control with his feathers, keeping people moving away from the zone without triggering panic. Good. The wing hero was smart enough to read a scene and act without being told. You're declaring those deaths as fact, Endeavor said carefully. Not as a threat. As information. Her chin lifted slightly. Whether it becomes a threat depends on what you do next. In 15 years of heroism, Endeavor had faced villains who leveled city blocks, Nomo with stacked quirks beyond rational engineering, a high end that had pushed him to his absolute limit and beyond. He had never, in any of those encounters, felt the specific quality of danger that radiated from this girl standing barefoot in a crater on a Kamino Ward highway. It wasn't her power, though the power was clearly extraordinary. It was the way she held it, not straining, not performing, not threatening. Simply present. The way a person stands in a kitchen holding a knife while making dinner. Casual ownership of something that could end everything in the room. His calm crackled. Hawks, frequency encrypted, voice stripped of its usual easy warmth, Endeavor. I'm coming down. Negative. Endeavor said quietly, angling the comm away from the girl. Hold position. Keep civilians back. She just cut a guardrail into pieces without moving, big guy. You need backup. Hold. Position. He looked back at the girl. She was still watching him with those flat red eyes, still standing perfectly still in her ring of scored asphalt, and he made a decision that 11 years ago he would never have made, that Kamino Ward itself had taught him, painfully and permanently, to make. He didn't reach for his fire. You said you don't know what world this is, he said. That means you didn't come here intentionally. For the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. Not softening, nothing so simple. More like recalibration. No, she said. I didn't. Then before anything else happens, Endeavor said, I need you to tell me your name. The highway was silent except for the distant wail of evacuation sirens and the soft hiss of his own shoulder flames. Lucy, she said. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop a character you'd want to see in the comments. Let's see who enters the MHA universe next. Hawks dropped from 400 meters in 3.2 seconds. It wasn't reckless, everything Hawks did had calculation behind the easy grin and the casual posture. He'd spent the last 90 seconds up there reading the scene with the same meticulous attention he applied to every villain encounter, cataloging variables while Endeavor held ground below. The girl, Lucy, hadn't moved from her crater. Hadn't attacked. Hadn't fled. She'd answered a direct question with her name, which in Hawk's experience put her ahead of roughly 60% of villains he'd encountered professionally. But the guardrail was in 7 pieces. The road surface looked like someone had taken a box cutter to it 10,000 times. And his feathers, the ones he'd drifted closest to her airspace, had come back wrong. 2 of them. The veins separated, not torn, not burned, separated along their shafts with a precision that no known quirk in the registry produced. He landed 15 meters to Endeavor's left, casual as stepping off a curb, scarlet wings folding. Hey, he said, pitching it friendly, the tone he used when he needed someone to believe the situation was under control. Rough landing. Lucy's red eyes moved to him with the same flat assessment she'd given Endeavor. If his reputation registered, she gave no sign of it. Another hero. Hawks. Number 2. He smiled. Well. Depending on who you ask. A beat, glancing at Endeavor, who did not smile back. So. Lucy. That's a great name. Very classic. You mentioned not knowing what world this is. Want to give us the short version of where you came from? No, she said. Fair enough. He kept his weight easy, relaxed, hands visible. His feathers fanned slightly behind him. Not aggressive, just present, the way he always kept them slightly deployed in uncertain situations. A passive early warning system. If something moved in that 4-meter radius, he'd feel it in the feathers before his eyes registered it. How about we start smaller? Are you hurt? Something about the question seemed to genuinely surprise her. Not the content, the delivery, maybe. The straightforwardness of it. Her eyes tracked across him with a new quality, still assessing but searching for something different now. I heal quickly, she said, which wasn't an answer to what he'd asked. That's a yes, then. He took one step forward. Measured. Deliberate. Watching her eyes for the shift that would tell him the step had crossed from acceptable to threatening. We've got medical support 2 minutes out. If you're willing to stand down, not surrender, just stand down, nobody's cuffing you without a conversation first, we can get you looked at and figure out the rest from there. Hawks. Endeavor's voice carried a low warning note. I've got it. He didn't look away from Lucy. One more step. 13 meters now. You said you killed 31 people. That's a significant number to lead with. Most people don't volunteer that information to heroes they just met. Most people try to hide what they are, Lucy said. I stopped doing that a long time ago. What are you? The question landed differently than he'd intended. He'd meant it tactically, probing for quirk classification, but the way it hit the air between them turned it into something else. Something bigger. Lucy's chin came up a fraction, and for just a moment, behind the flatness in her red eyes, Hawks caught a glimpse of something that lived much deeper. Not anger. Not grief exactly. Something that had been both of those things for so long it had calcified into something without a clean name. Dangerous, she said. Yeah. He stopped walking. 12 meters. I got that from the guardrail. He tilted his head slightly. Here's the thing about dangerous, though. Dangerous and villain aren't the same word. I've met plenty of dangerous people who weren't villains. Some of them are standing behind me right now. He let that sit for a beat. The 31 people. Were they trying to kill you? The silence stretched 4 full seconds. Yes, she said. Then we're having a different conversation than I thought. He glanced back at Endeavor, quick, communicating something with his eyes that the older hero received and processed without expression. Then back to Lucy. Okay. Here's what I'm proposing. You stay exactly where you are. We stay exactly where we are. Nobody moves, nobody escalates. In about 90 seconds, my feathers are going to tell me if you tense up before you do, so I'll know before anything happens. That's not a threat, it's just transparency. A small, genuine smile this time, not the performed one. I like transparency. It's underrated. Lucy looked at him for a long moment. You're trying to de-escalate. I'm trying to not die, Hawk said honestly. The escalation is just the practical method. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, he wouldn't have believed warmth, and she probably would have read his disbelief. But the quality of her attention changed, the way a weapon changes when someone's finger moves away from the trigger without being told to. Still a weapon. Just slightly less imminent. Then his feathers screamed. Not a metaphor. The sensation that ripped through his quirk sense was exactly that, a shriek of wrongness transmitted through the telepathic link he maintained with every individual feather. 12 of them, deployed in a loose perimeter behind Lucy's position, simply ceased to exist as coherent structures. He felt each one come apart with a precision that was almost gentle, veins separating, shafts splitting along their length, and the information his quirk sent back was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He hadn't seen her move. He hadn't felt the air displacement. No sound, no visual indicator, no motion his eyes could track. 12 feathers, silently disassembled at a range. He couldn't have anticipated, and Lucy was still standing in her crater with her hands at her sides and her red eyes fixed on him with an expression that said this had been a demonstration, not an attack. 14 meters, she said. Not 4. I shortened my range when I arrived here to avoid unnecessary casualties. My actual range is 14 meters. Hawks became very still. I'm telling you this, she continued, in the same tone she'd used to tell Endeavor about the 31 deaths. Factual, stripped of performance, so that you understand the situation accurately. You said you like transparency. Behind him, he heard Endeavor's flames surge, not an attack, just the involuntary physical response of a man recalibrating his threat assessment at speed. Hawks understood the feeling completely. He was doing the same thing, just more quietly. 14 meters meant both of them were already inside the kill zone. Had been since they landed. Okay, Hawk said, and his voice came out steadier than he deserved credit for. Okay. Thank you for telling us that. He exhaled slowly. Can I ask why you didn't use it? Lucy's eyes moved between him and Endeavor. Something worked in her expression, slow and private, like arithmetic being done by hand. Because, she said finally, you asked if I was hurt. The evacuation sirens wailed in the middle distance. Somewhere above them, helicopter rotors. News crews, or the Commission's rapid response units, or both. The sun was finishing its descent behind the waterfront buildings, and in the growing dark, the scores in the asphalt around Lucy's feet looked like something had tried to write a language no one living could read. Hawks didn't move. Didn't reach for his remaining feathers. Didn't signal Endeavor. He just stood there, 12 meters from a girl who could have killed them both before either of them blinked, and tried to figure out what kind of story led a person to the specific place we're being asked. About their injuries was reason enough not to. It wasn't a short story, he suspected. It wasn't a kind one, either. The Hero Public Safety Commission moved fast when it wanted to. Within 40 minutes of the Kamino Ward incident hitting internal channels, a black vehicle convoy was already rolling out of the Commission's Tokyo headquarters, not police units, not standard Hero support staff, but the quiet tier of Commission operations that didn't appear in public-facing documentation. The ones with equipment requisitions that went through 3 layers of authorization and came back stamped with classification codes that even most pro-heroes had never seen. Takashi Morimoto, Commission Field Director, rode in the lead vehicle with a tablet displaying everything the on-site cameras had captured in the 12 minutes between Lucy's arrival and the news helicopters getting close enough to matter. He watched the guardrail footage 4 times. The feather disassembly twice. He paused on the moment Hawks had taken his second step forward and Lucy had simply looked at him, catalogued him, with those flat red eyes. He made 2 calls before the convoy reached the highway interchange. The first was to the Quirk Registration Bureau's Anomaly Division, requesting an emergency classification review. No quirk in the registry produced invisible cutting vectors of that range and precision. Either this was an unregistered quirk, which carried its own legal implications. Or it was something the Bureau's taxonomy didn't currently have a category for, which carried implications significantly larger. The second call was to someone whose name didn't appear in commission directories at all. By the time Morimoto's convoy arrived at the perimeter Hawk's feathers had established, the situation on the highway had reached a state of armed stillness. Lucy hadn't moved from her crater. Endeavor and Hawks maintained their positions. For support course graduates in containment gear had set up at the perimeter's edge with equipment that looked, to civilian eyes, like survey instruments, and were in fact running continuous quirk energy readings. Their expressions, visible even under their helmets, communicated that the readings were not making them feel better. Morimoto stepped out of the vehicle, straightened his jacket, and walked toward Endeavor with the brisk efficiency of a man who considered every second of delay a resource expenditure. Situation report. Endeavor didn't turn his head. Unregistered. Foreign national, possibly. Quirk classified as multivector invisible cutting, range confirmed at 14 meters, demonstrated precision sufficient to disassemble carbon fiber composite structures at the molecular level. A pause. She's been cooperative. Cooperative, Morimoto repeated, with the specific flatness of a man translating a word into a language he trusted more. He looked past Endeavor at Lucy, still standing in her crater 40 meters distant, and felt something he didn't allow himself to feel often. The cold recognition of a variable that didn't fit his existing models. She declared 31 prior casualties voluntarily. Correct. And she's made no aggressive moves since disclosure. Negative. Hawks attempted closer approach. She demonstrated extended range without deploying it offensively. Then stopped. Endeavor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She said it was because he asked if she was hurt. Morimoto was quiet for 3 seconds. That's either the most sophisticated manipulation I've ever heard of, he said, or something considerably more complicated. He pulled out his own comm unit. I'm invoking Emergency Containment Protocol 7. We're classifying her as an S-class anomaly pending full assessment. She'll hear that, Hawk said from Morimoto's left, not loudly. The wing hero had drifted closer during the exchange, quiet as his namesake. 14-meter range means our entire perimeter team is inside her kill zone. If she decides commission language sounds like a threat. I'm aware of the geometry, Hawks. Just making sure, because the geometry is pretty important right now. Morimoto looked at him with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years managing heroes and had developed specific tolerances for each variety of insubordination. The protocol is administrative. It affects our response posture, not hers. He raised his voice, not toward Lucy, but toward the containment team. Passive monitoring only. No active emissions. No containment field deployment. He then did something that surprised both heroes. He walked forward. Alone. Hands visible, no equipment, no escort, at a measured pace that communicated bureaucratic confidence rather than heroic bravado. He stopped at 20 meters, outside her stated range, technically, though Morimoto was privately skeptical that 14 was her actual limit, and addressed her directly. My name is Morimoto. I represent the body that oversees pro-hero operations in Japan. I want to be straightforward with you about what's happening right now, so there's no misunderstanding. He kept his voice level, professional. You represent a situation our existing frameworks don't fully account for. That means decisions are going to be made about you by people with authority, in rooms you're not in, based on incomplete information. That process has already started. I'm telling you this because I find that people respond better to transparency than to discovering things after the fact. Lucy studied him. You're not a fighter. No. But you're more dangerous than either of them, she said, with a small motion of her chin toward Endeavor and Hawks, because you decide what they do. Morimoto absorbed this without visible reaction. That's a perceptive red. I've dealt with your kind before, Lucy said. There was no particular heat in it. Just the flat weight of experience. Facilities. Research divisions. People who look at what I am and see a resource to be controlled. Her red eyes held his with unsteadiness that most people, most heroes, even, found difficult to sustain under. How long before you try to put me in a room? That depends entirely on you, Morimoto said. No, Lucy said. It depends entirely on you. That's the point. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the kind that forms when two people have understood each other completely and neither particularly likes what they've understood. It was Hawks who moved first, stepping up beside Morimoto with his hands in his pockets, deliberately casual, deliberately non-threatening, the anti-commission energy he deployed like a secondary quirk. "Here's the thing nobody's saying out loud," he said, addressing Lucy but pitching it loud enough for Morimoto to hear every word. "You arrived here from somewhere else. You don't know this world. You've already said you didn't come here intentionally." He shrugged. "That means somewhere, there might be a way back. And figuring that out requires resources and information that the Commission actually has. A beat. So the question isn't really about rooms. It's about whether the thing that gets you home faster is cooperation or confrontation." Lucy was quiet for a long time. Above them, the news helicopters had multiplied. Morimoto could already calculate the morning's headlines, the Commission's press office scrambling, Diet members calling for statements. The window for controlling this narrative was measured in hours, possibly less. "I've heard that argument before too," Lucy said finally. "Cooperation. It was always a room at the end of it." "Yeah," Hawk said. "I bet it was. He didn't try to counter it. Didn't reach for a reframe or a reassurance. Just let it sit there, acknowledged, real. I'm not going to tell you this is different. I don't know if it is." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm just telling you I'll be watching what happens. Personally." Something in Lucy's expression shifted, subtle, deep, the way bedrock shifts rather than surface water. Not trust. Something that might, under specific conditions, become the precondition for trust. Morimoto noted it clinically. Then he noted something else, his secure comm unit vibrating in his breast pocket with a priority signal from an identifier he recognized as the second call he'd made in the convoy. The League of Villains Communications Intercept Unit had just flagged unusual chatter. Someone else had been watching the Kamino Ward footage. Tamura Shigaraki watched the footage 11 times. Not because he needed to, he understood what he was looking at after the second viewing, the invisible geometry of it, the way the guardrail segments had fallen with that specific clean-edged precision that spoke of something operating on a level entirely removed from conventional quirk physics. He watched it 11 times because something about it made a feeling move through him that he hadn't experienced in long enough that he'd almost forgotten its texture. Excitement. Not the brittle, destructive excitement of decay spreading through a target, or the sharp satisfaction of watching Hero Society scramble in response to the League's operations. Something older. Something that had lived in him as a child, before All for One had shaped and focused and weaponized him, when he had still been capable of encountering something in the world and thinking simply, "I want to know what that is." "Run it again," he said. Compress obliged from her position at the monitor array, her porcelain mask angled toward him with the particular quality of attention that meant she was reading his mood and filing the information away for later. Beside her, Dobby leaned against the wall of the bar's back room with his arms crossed and his scarred face arranged in the expression of someone who found everything mildly contemptible, which was his default. "A kid," Dobby said. "With horns." "With vectors," Shigaraki corrected. Invisible cutting forces of at minimum 14 meters range, demonstrated precision sufficient to separate composite materials at the structural level without visible motion, sound, or detectable energy emission. He paused the footage on Lucy's face, her red eyes fixed on Hawks with that flat, assessing calm. "The Commission is already running anomaly classification. That means their existing quirk taxonomy doesn't cover it. Which means she didn't come from a registered lineage. Or she came from somewhere else entirely," Spinner said from the corner, quietly. Shigaraki looked at him. "Yes," he said. "That's the more interesting possibility." Twice had been summoned and was present in her villain costume, sitting on the bar counter with her legs swinging, her mask's two expressions cycling through their perpetual argument about what they were looking at. "She's incredibly powerful," one face said. "She'll get us all killed," the other replied. Both of those things, twice said out loud, to no one in particular, seem true. Both of those things, Shigaraki agreed, are exactly why we're going to get to her before the commission does. Dabi pushed off the wall. And do what with her? She's not going to join the league because we asked nicely. That girl on the footage isn't someone who joins things. No, Shigaraki said. She's not. He resumed the footage, watching Lucy deliver her 14-meter revelation to Hawks with the calm of someone handing over a fact rather than a threat. But she doesn't have to join the league. She has to understand that the commission will put her in a room and study her until there's nothing left worth studying, and that we're the only ones offering an alternative. We'd put her in a room too, Compress observed mildly. We'd try, Shigaraki said. The difference is she'd escape. And in escaping, she'd owe us nothing and we'd have learned everything we needed to know about her actual capabilities. He finally looked away from the frozen image of Lucy's face. Either she becomes an asset or she becomes a demonstration. Either outcome advances the league's position. The room processed this in its various ways. Dabi with flat cynicism, Compress with measured calculation, Spinner with the particular discomfort of someone who had joined a revolution and kept discovering the revolution's pragmatic edges. Twice argued with himself. Mr. Compress tilted his head at a precise angle. Who goes? Compress asked. Shigaraki scratched at his neck. Dabi and Toga. Toga for approach, she reads people and she doesn't read like a threat until she wants to. Dabi for. He considered. Dabi because if this goes wrong, I need someone whose loss I can absorb. Dabi's expression didn't change. Great vote of confidence. It's not a vote of confidence. It's resource allocation. Shigaraki stood, his hand resting on the bar surface with one finger raised, the unconscious habit that kept his quirk from activating unintentionally. The commission is going to move Lucy within the next 2 hours. Morimoto is smart enough to know that the highway is an uncontrolled environment and he'll want her in a controlled one before the news cycle fully activates. He looked at Dabi. You have 90 minutes. And if she decides to take both of us apart before we finish our opening sentence? Then you were too slow, Shigaraki said simply, and left the room. Toga found Lucy first. This was, in retrospect, inevitable. Himiko Toga's particular genius, the thing that made her genuinely dangerous in ways that went beyond her quirk, was her ability to identify the precise emotional frequency of a situation and tune herself to it without appearing to try. She had watched the same footage as Shigaraki, but she had watched it differently. While everyone else was calculating range and precision and tactical implications, Toga had been watching Lucy's face. Specifically, she had been watching the moment Hawks asked if she was hurt. Toga understood that moment in a specific way that people understand things that have happened to them. She came in from the north, civilian clothes, the chaos of the media perimeter providing cover that her quirk didn't need to manufacture. The commission's containment team had established a hard boundary at 60 meters, which was sensible given the stated range data but left substantial dead ground between the perimeter and Lucy's position that a small girl in a school uniform could navigate if she moved during the right news helicopter rotation. Lucy heard her coming. Toga understood this immediately from the way those red eyes found her at 20 meters, not surprised, not alarmed, simply informed. The vectors had already catalogued her. You're not a hero, Lucy said. Nope. Toga crouched down at the crater's edge, elbows on her knees, chin in her hands, looking up at Lucy with an expression of open, genuine fascination. You're the most interesting thing that's happened in months. I had to come see in person. The commission will see you. Probably. Toga shrugged cheerfully. I'm fast. She tilted her head. You came from somewhere else. Somewhere really bad, I'm guessing, based on. Her eyes moved across Lucy with a directness that was oddly non-threatening in its transparency, basically everything about you. Lucy said nothing. The people who are about to put you in a room, Toga said, her voice dropping the cheerful register and landing somewhere quieter and more real, they're going to tell you it's for assessment. For your safety. For everyone's safety. She met Lucy's eyes directly. They told me things like that too. Before I was what I am now. The highway was loud with helicopter noise and distant crowd barriers. Between them, the scored asphalt held its pattern of invisible violence like a map of somewhere neither of them had ever wanted to be. Who sent you? Lucy asked. Someone who wants to offer you an alternative to the room, Toga said. Whether it's a better alternative, she smiled, and it was a real smile, complicated and a little broken around the edges, that's harder to promise. Lucy looked at her for a long time. Not with the flat assessment she'd given the heroes and Morimoto. With something more complicated, the look of a person recognizing, against their better judgment, something in another person's face that they hadn't expected to find. You've been in the room, Lucy said. Toga's smile stayed. Yeah, she said softly. I have. Above them, a commission helicopter was already breaking from the news formation, its flight path correcting toward the highway perimeter with the purposeful precision of an institution that had just noticed an unexpected variable in its controlled situation. 90 meters away, Hawks felt 3 of his remaining feathers go still. Hawks felt the feathers go still the way you feel a held breath, not the absence of sensation but the presence of a specific, weighted silence where something active used to be. 3 of them. The ones he drifted into the dead ground north of the perimeter during the commission's setup, so low and slow they'd been effectively invisible against the highway surface. Gone quiet in a way that meant they were intact, not disassembled like the earlier 12, just pinned. Held. The vector equivalent of a hand placed firmly over a window to block the draft. She knew they were there. Had known the whole time. Had chosen now to tell him she knew. He was moving before the conscious decision formed, angling north along the perimeter's inner edge with the loose-limbed velocity that let him cover ground without looking like he was covering ground, comm already open on Endeavor's frequency. We have a contact in the dead zone. Small, civilian clothes, female, approximately 16. A pause. Lucy's not reacting aggressively. She's talking to her. Endeavor's voice came back immediately. League? Unknown. Possibly. He could see them now, Lucy in her crater, the newcomer crouched at the edge with her chin in her hands like she was watching something interesting at a park. The body language was wrong for a hostage situation and wrong for a recruitment pitch and wrong for basically every category Hawks had professional experience with. It looked, unsettlingly, like 2 people recognizing each other across a distance that had nothing to do with meters. Hold the commission's helicopter. If they spook the contact before I get a read. I don't have authority over commission air assets. Endeavor. A 3-second pause. I'll make a suggestion. Hawks reached the northern edge of the perimeter and stopped, using a overturned news van as visual cover, close enough now to hear fragments of the conversation if the wind held. He caught room. And Lucy's response, clearer, yeah. I have. He filed that away in the part of his mind where he kept the things that changed his understanding of a situation, which was already considerably fuller than it had been 40 minutes ago. Then he looked at the crouched girl more carefully. Civilian clothes, but the way she held herself inside them was wrong, the specific ease of someone in a costume rather than an outfit. Blonde hair, yellow eyes visible even at this distance, the particular quality of attention she was paying Lucy that Hawks recognized as professional. Not hero professional. The other kind. His comm vibrated. Morimoto, text only, identity confirmed. Toga Himiko, League of Villains. Do not engage. Commission containment team moving to intercept. Hawks looked at the commission helicopter correcting its flight path overhead and made a fast, private calculation. If the containment team moved on Toga now, Lucy would read it as escalation. After everything she'd said about rooms and facilities and the people who built them, a coordinated commission response to someone she'd just begun to tolerate would hit exactly the wrong frequency. The situation would go from armed stillness to something considerably louder and more irreversible within seconds. He stepped out from behind the van. Walked forward. Hands visible, pace unhurried, making himself loud enough to see without being loud enough to startle. "Hey," he said, pitching it at the same easy register he'd used with Lucy. "Didn't expect company." Toga looked up at him with yellow eyes that assessed and discarded his threat level in approximately 1 second. "Hawks," she said brightly. "Big fan." "Sure you are." He stopped at the crater's edge, 5 meters from Toga, 12 from Lucy, and looked between them with the expression of a man who had walked into a conversation and needed to understand it faster than was strictly comfortable. "Lucy. You okay?" "She came to offer me an alternative," Lucy said, without inflection. "To the room Morimoto is planning." "The League's alternative," Hawks said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "And?" Lucy's red eyes moved from him to Toga and back with the deliberateness of someone taking a measurement. "She's been in a room," Lucy said. "She understands what that means better than you do." Hawks absorbed this without flinching, which cost him something. Because it was true, and he knew it was true, and the specific way Lucy said it, not as an accusation but as a data point, made it land harder than an accusation would have. "That's fair," he said. "I won't argue that." He looked at Toga. "What's the League offering?" Toga smiled, bright and complicated. "Freedom." "The League doesn't offer freedom. They offer a different kind of controlled environment with worse dental coverage." "Hawks," Lucy said, and something in her tone made both him and Toga look at her, stop performing for each other. Her eyes moved to Toga first. "You came here because Shigaraki sent you. Whatever he wants from me, it isn't my well-being." Then to Hawks. "And you came here because the commission told you someone unauthorized was in the perimeter. Whatever Morimoto wants from me, it isn't my well-being either." She looked between them with a flatness that had calcified from something once much rawer. "Neither of you is offering me anything. You're both managing me toward outcomes your organizations have already decided on." The silence that followed had the specific quality of two people who had been caught doing exactly what they were accused of. It was Toga who broke it, and she did it in a way Hawks didn't anticipate. Not with a deflection or a counter-argument but with a sound that was almost a laugh, short and genuine and a little sad around the edges. "Yeah," she said. "Okay. That's accurate." She stood up from her crouch, brushing highway grit from her knees with the unhurried ease of someone who had already recalibrated. "But accurate doesn't mean the options are equal." She looked at Lucy directly. "The commission will study you until there's nothing left. Shigaraki will use you until there's nothing left. Those aren't the same nothing." "How are they different?" Lucy asked. "The commission does it slowly," Toga said, "and calls it protection." Lucy was quiet for 4 seconds. Then something happened that Hawks had not seen since her arrival and would think about for considerably longer than was professionally appropriate. Her eyes changed. Not softened. Not warmed. But the flatness shifted, the calcified surface of it cracking along a line so fine it was almost invisible, revealing something underneath that had no business being as alive as it was. "I had someone," Lucy said. "Once. In my world." The words came out measured, spaced, like she was lifting something heavy and didn't want to drop it. "He didn't see what I was first. He saw me first." She looked at Toga. "You're trying to use that. The recognition. The similarity." A pause. "I know you are." Toga met her eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Another beat. "Doesn't mean the recognition isn't real." Above them, the commission helicopter completed its correction and began its descent toward the perimeter's northern edge. 30 seconds, Hawks calculated. Maybe less. He made a decision that Morimoto was going to be deeply unhappy about. "Lucy," he said quietly. "I can't stop what happens in the next 30 seconds. The commission is going to move, and I don't have the authority to override that, and even if I did." He paused, finding the honest version of what he wanted to say rather than the managed one. "I'm not sure I should. Because I genuinely don't know what's right here." He held her red gaze steadily. "But I'm asking you, not as a hero, not as number 2, just as the person who asked if you were hurt. Don't let Toga make this choice for you. Don't let the commission make it either. A beat. Make it yourself." Lucy looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Toga. Then she looked at the commission helicopter touching down 40 meters north, its doors already opening, figures in containment gear moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Her hands, which had been still at her side since she landed, moved for the first time, not toward anyone, not in threat. Just slightly apart from her body. A small motion. The kind a person makes when they're breathing through a decision. "I'll go," she said. "With the commission." Toga's expression didn't collapse, but something behind it did, a small, contained thing, like a door closing in a room no one else could see. She nodded once, and Hawks noted that the nod was genuine. "Okay," Toga said softly. Then, lower, directed at Lucy alone, "when it becomes a room, and it will, remember who told you first." She was gone before the containment team reached them, small and fast and swallowed by the dark between the news vans, and Hawks was left standing at the crater's edge with the commission closing in and the absolute certainty, settled in his chest like ballast, that Lucy going willingly with Morimoto was not the end of anything. It was the specific beginning of something considerably worse. The commission's containment facility sat 40 kilometers outside Tokyo in a complex that appeared on public records as an agricultural research station. It was not an agricultural research station. The building's actual designation was Response Architecture 7, one of 6 facilities maintained by the Hero Public Safety Commission for the containment and assessment of Quirk anomalous individuals whose threat classification exceeded what standard Hero infrastructure could manage. The other 5 handled things like Quirk singularity events, uncontrolled mutations, and the occasional villain whose ability had developed beyond their own management. Response Architecture 7 was the one they used for things that didn't fit the other 5's parameters. Lucy was processed through intake with the brisk, professional efficiency that Morimoto's operation ran on. Medical scan first. The attending physician's face cycling through several expressions during the results before settling on the carefully neutral look of someone who had decided that what they were seeing was someone else's problem to classify. Blood work drawn, the nurse noting with visible discomfort that the puncture site closed faster than standard healing quirks accounted for. Height, weight, biometric profile. The clinical gown replaced with facility clothing, which Lucy accepted without comment and without the resistance the intake team had quietly prepared for. She was cooperative in the way that a sea is calm, not because nothing was happening beneath the surface, but because what was beneath the surface had decided, for now, that the surface was fine. Morimoto observed the intake process through monitors in the facility's operations center, Endeavor standing beside him with his arms crossed and the expression he wore when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. Hawks was present too, leaning against the wall with the studied casualness that meant he was paying close attention to everything. Healing factor consistent with cellular regeneration class 3 or above, the medical officer reported over the comm, possibly higher, our upper range instruments may not be calibrated for whatever this is. The horns are fully biological, integrated at the bone level, neural tissue extending through them suggests sensory function. Possibly the mechanism for the vector generation, though we don't have a framework for how that would work physically. A pause. Sir, her blood work is, we're going to need the anomaly division's geneticist on site. There are chromosomal markers here that aren't in any registry. How long for the geneticist? 4 hours. Make it 2. Morimoto ended the comm and turned to the monitors. Lucy was sitting on the edge of the facility bed in her intake room, still and straight-backed, looking at the wall with the patience of someone who had learned patience the hard way. She went willingly, he said, mostly to himself. She went on her own terms, Hawks corrected from the wall. Those aren't the same thing. Morimoto looked at him. Toga was League. Yes. You had 30 seconds to detain her. I had 30 seconds to make a choice about whether detaining a League member in Lucy's immediate vicinity was worth what it would cost in terms of Lucy's cooperation. Hawks met his gaze evenly. I made the call I thought gave us the best long-term outcome. That call wasn't yours to make. No, Hawks agreed. It wasn't. He didn't apologize. Morimoto noted this and moved on, because Hawks not apologizing for judgment calls was a known variable in working with him, and the outcome had been Lucy walking into the facility voluntarily, which was worth more than the argument. Endeavor hadn't spoken since intake began. Now he did. The Toga contact troubles me more than the Commission's response posture, he said, in the specific tone he used when he'd been thinking something through and had reached a conclusion he didn't like. Lucy assessed her accurately. She knew Toga was using the emotional recognition play and she went willingly with us anyway. He paused. That's not the behavior of someone who can be manipulated through emotional appeals. No, Hawk said. It's the behavior of someone who understood all the manipulation on the table and made a choice anyway. Which means she's operating with significantly more agency than the situation looks like. Morimoto looked back at the monitor. Lucy hadn't moved. What did she say to Toga? Before you arrived. Hawks was quiet for a moment. She said she had someone. In her world. Someone who saw her before they saw what she was. Another pause. She said Toga was using that. The operations center was quiet. That's important, Morimoto said finally. Yeah, Hawk said. I thought so too. Endeavor volunteered for the first assessment interview. This surprised Morimoto enough that he asked for clarification, which Endeavor provided with characteristic economy. She responded to directness. I'm direct. Morimoto approved it because the alternative was a commission assessor Lucy had no existing relationship with. An existing relationship was a generous term for what Endeavor and Lucy had, but it was more than nothing. The interview room was standard. Table, 2 chairs, recording equipment that Lucy had certainly identified and chose not to comment on. Endeavor sat across from her with no file, no tablet, no props. Just himself, which had always been sufficient. Lucy looked at him with those red eyes that gave nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. You volunteered, she said. Not a question. Yes. Why? Endeavor considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and delivered it anyway because Hawk's observation about Lucy and directness had landed in him somewhere accurate. Because I wanted to understand something, he said, and I thought you'd answer me more honestly than you'd answer. Me more honestly than you'd answer someone you hadn't already met. What do you want to understand? The 31 people, he said. You led with that. Unprompted. Before we asked about your quirk, before we asked what you wanted, before anything else. You told us you'd killed 31 people. He held her gaze steadily. Why? Lucy was quiet for a long moment. Outside the facility's walls, the agricultural cover story hummed with its fake machinery, and somewhere in the ventilation system, a fan cycled with the particular rhythm of buildings that were built for function rather than comfort. Because I've spent a long time, she said finally, having people decide what I am based on incomplete information. And then being surprised when their incomplete picture didn't survive contact with the complete one. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite challenge and wasn't quite exhaustion, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I told you what I am first. So that whatever you decided came from something real. Endeavor absorbed this. Then he said, "What happened to you before this?" It wasn't a question about the 31. It was a different question, and Lucy heard the difference. He watched it land in her. Watched something shift behind the flatness of her expression, the bedrock movement again, slow and deep. "Experiments," she said. "Confinement. People deciding what I was worth based on what they could extract from me." A pause. "It started when I was very young." Endeavor's jaw set in the specific way it did when something hit the place in him that had never fully healed. The place that knew, with the intimate knowledge of personal history, exactly what it looked like when power was used against a child. His fire, passive until now, shifted almost imperceptibly in temperature. "I have a son," he said, and the words came out differently than anything else he'd said in the interview, stripped of professional register, just the words themselves. "He has a quirk that could level a city block if it went wrong. When he was small, there were people who looked at him and saw a resource." He paused. "I understand, partially, what you're describing." Lucy studied him with a new quality of attention. "You did something about it," she said. "Not quite a question." "Eventually," he said. "Not as quickly as I should have." The silence that followed had a different texture than any that had come before. Not the armed stillness of the highway, not the administrative quiet of intake. Something rawer and more mutual, two people who had learned their specific shapes from specific kinds of damage, recognizing the architecture in each other without needing to name it. "The facility I came from," Lucy said finally, "looked nothing like this. But it felt exactly like this." Her eyes moved to the recording equipment in the corner, then back to Endeavor. "How long before Morimoto's geneticist tells him something that changes what I am to him from a person to a specimen?" Endeavor held her gaze. He did not tell her it wouldn't happen. He was direct, and directness meant not lying about things they both already knew. 2 hours, he said quietly. "Maybe less." Lucy nodded once, slowly. Like she'd expected exactly that answer, and the confirmation was its own kind of information. Outside the interview room, Hawk stood at the monitor feed with his arms crossed and his usual easy expression entirely absent, watching Endeavor and Lucy sit across from each other in the particular silence of two people who had just told each other something true. His comm vibrated. "Morimoto, text, geneticist arriving early. 90 minutes. Hawks looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked back at the monitor, at Lucy's face, at the way she'd nodded when Endeavor told her the truth. He typed back a single word, "understood." And stood there for a while longer, understanding it, and not particularly liking what he understood. The geneticist's name was Dr. Saito Yuriko, and she had spent 19 years working in the Commission's Anomaly Division cataloging chromosomal deviations, quirk factor mutations, and the occasional biological impossibility that fell outside registered taxonomy. She looked at Lucy's blood work for 40 seconds before she picked up her secure comm unit and called Morimoto directly, bypassing the standard reporting chain entirely. "Director," she said, when he picked up. "I need you to understand something before I file any official documentation." "Doctor." "What I'm looking at," she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing every word as though it might be used against them later, "is not a quirk mutation. It's not an unregistered lineage variant. It's not a novel expression of existing genetic architecture." She paused. "This girl carries a second chromosome pair that does not exist in human biology. Or in any registered non-human species taxonomy I have access to." Another pause, longer. "She is not a variant of humanity, Director. She is a parallel development. Something that evolved alongside humanity, or was engineered from it, in conditions sufficiently divergent that the result is, taxonomically, genetically, fundamentally, a different species." The silence on Morimoto's end lasted 4 seconds. "Conclusions?" "That her vectors aren't a quirk," Dr. Saito said. "They're a biological organ system. As natural to her as lungs are to us. She looked back at the blood work results on her screen. And that if the Commission proceeds with standard anomaly assessment protocol, we will be conducting non-consensual medical research on a sentient being from a separate evolutionary lineage. A pause that carried considerable weight. I wanted you to have that framing before the paperwork started. Morimoto ended the call. He stood in the operations center for 90 seconds without speaking, which was the longest Hawks had ever seen him still. Then he turned to the room with the expression of a man who had just watched his existing decision tree become significantly more complicated. Assessment protocol is suspended pending legal review, he said. Nobody touches that blood work without my direct authorization. Hawks felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Good call. It's not a moral call, Morimoto said flatly. It's a liability call. If she's legally classifiable as a non-human sentient species, the Commission's authority framework doesn't cover her. We'd be operating outside our mandate. He looked at the monitor showing Lucy's intake room. Which means we have approximately 4 hours before our legal counsel tells us we have to either charge her under villain statutes, which requires documented criminal acts on Japanese soil, which we don't have, or release her. Release her to what? Endeavor said, from the doorway. He'd come straight from the interview room, still carrying the specific quality of quiet that the conversation with Lucy had left on him. She has nowhere to go. No documents, no registered identity, no place in this world's infrastructure. That, Morimoto said, is not legally the Commission's problem. It's practically everyone's problem, Hawk said. The argument that followed was administrative and therefore bloodless, which made it in some ways worse. 3 people who understood the situation with reasonable clarity, constrained by the architecture of institutions that had been built for different situations, negotiating in the narrow space between what was right and what was authorized. Hawks had spent enough of his career in that space to navigate it without losing himself in it, but it never stopped feeling like operating in a room where the walls were slowly moving inward. He left the argument running and went back to the monitor. Lucy felt the shift before she had language for it. It wasn't dramatic, no alarms, no change in the facility's ambient sound, no visible alteration in the ventilation rhythm or the corridor lighting beyond her door. But something in the building's operational texture changed, the way barometric pressure changes before weather, and she had spent enough of her life in facilities to read that texture the way other people read faces. Something had changed in how they were thinking about her. She stood from the bed and walked to the room's single window, narrow, reinforced, looking out at a courtyard that confirmed the agricultural cover story with the specific overcorrection of fake things. Too neat. Too intentional. She put her hand flat against the glass and extended a single vector, slowly, testing. The glass was standard reinforced composite. Her vector went through it like it wasn't there, extending 4 meters into the courtyard before she pulled it back. No resistance field. No dampening technology. Either they hadn't had time to install countermeasures, or they'd decided countermeasures were unnecessary given her voluntary cooperation, or, and this was the reading she trusted most, they hadn't believed, at the institutional level, that what she was required them. They were revising that assessment now. She could feel it in the building's changed texture. The door opened. Not a guard. Hawks, alone, without the commission jacket he'd been wearing earlier, which she read as intentional costuming. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it with his hands in his pockets, the casual posture that she had learned was not actually casual, and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "How long do I have?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. Morimoto suspended the assessment protocol. "You've got 4 hours before the legal situation forces a decision." He paused. "The commission's geneticist found something in your blood work." "I know what she found." He absorbed this. "You knew what you were before you got here." "I've always known what I am," Lucy said. The words came out without heat, which made them land harder than heat would have. Other people's discovery of it is a separate event. She looked at him steadily. What does Morimoto do with 4 hours? Tries to find a legal framework that keeps you contained without exceeding the Commission's authority, Hawk said. Probably fails. Releases you with a monitoring agreement you're not obligated to honor. He paused. Or something else happens first. The League. They know where you are, he said. Toga made it back. Shigaraki's patient when he needs to be, but 4 hours is enough time to move. He watched her face. There are also, a slight hesitation, other interested parties. Things the Commission's intercept unit is picking up that aren't League traffic. Lucy turned from the window. What other parties? Hawks looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much truth the situation warranted. He'd been doing that calculation since the highway, and each time he'd landed slightly further toward full disclosure than his training recommended. Something called the Paranormal Liberation Front has a listening post that picked up the Kamino Ward footage. They're a reorganized faction, bigger than the League, more structured, different ideology. He paused. And there's chatter from an independent research group that the Commission has been monitoring for 2 years. Private funding, no government affiliation, very specific interest in non-standard biological profiles. The last sentence landed in Lucy with a specific weight. Private funding. Non-standard biological profiles. Research. She had heard those words assembled in that order before. In a different language, in a different world, from people who had looked at her through observation glass and written things in clipboards and called what they were doing science. Something moved through her that wasn't quite anger, anger was too hot, too present tense. This was older. The thing anger becomes when it has nowhere left to go and nothing left to burn. They already know I'm here, she said. It wasn't a question. The footage was public for 11 minutes before we suppressed it, Hawk said. 11 minutes is enough. He pushed off the door, moving to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the fake courtyard with the specific expression of someone who had made their mind up about something and was checking it one more time before committing. Lucy. The Commission can't protect you from any of these groups within their existing mandate. They can barely protect you from themselves right now. He turned to look at her directly. I'm not the Commission in this moment. I'm just telling you. Whatever you decide to do in the next 4 hours, decide it like every faction in this country is moving toward this building. Because they are. Lucy looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the courtyard. At the vectors she'd extended and retracted through the glass. At the distance between the window and the facility's outer wall, which her spatial awareness had been mapping since intake with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had always needed to know where the exits were. You came here alone, she said. Without Morimoto's authorization. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because you asked if you were hurt and I didn't ask you the same thing back, he said. And I've been thinking about that since the highway. He met her eyes. So. Are you? The question hit the same place it had hit on the highway, the specific unguarded place that the question's plainness opened up in her, the place that all her vectors and all her flatness and all her years of calcified survival couldn't fully armor because it was the place the armor had been built to protect. Her answer, when it came, was very quiet. Yes, she said. The facility's alarm system activated 40 seconds later. Not the Commission's alarm, something external, something that hit the building's perimeter sensors with a signature the system didn't have a classification for. Hawks was already moving toward the door, calm live, Morimoto's voice cutting through with the clipped urgency of a man whose 4 hours had just become 4 minutes. We have a breach, Morimoto said. Northern perimeter. It's not the League. Hawks stopped at the door. Looked back at Lucy, who was still standing at the window with her hand flat against the glass, looking out at the courtyard with an expression that was no longer flat. Something had come up through the calcified surface. Not warmth, not fear, not the complicated thing she'd shown Endeavor in the interview room. Readiness. "Stay here," Hawk said. Lucy looked at him with those red eyes that had been cataloging exits since she arrived. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The northern perimeter breach wasn't clean. Clean breaches were the League's signature, Kurogiri's warp gates depositing operatives with surgical precision, in and out before sensor arrays fully registered the intrusion. What hit response architecture 7's northern wall was different. A coordinated, multi-point penetration that suggested significant resources, advanced reconnaissance, and a level of operational planning that the League, for all its recent growth, hadn't demonstrated in field operations. 4 points simultaneously. Motion sensors, pressure plates, the Commission's passive Quirk emission detectors, all triggered within the same 1.3-second window, which meant either someone had mapped the sensor grid with considerable thoroughness or someone had a quirk that let them see it in real time. Morimoto was in the operations center when the board lit up, and he processed the breach pattern with the speed of someone who had run containment scenarios professionally for 2 decades. "This isn't the League," he said again, to no one in particular, because the room already knew it and saying it out loud was how he organized his thinking. 4-point simultaneous penetration requires coordination beyond their current operational capacity. He looked at the sensor readouts. Quirk signatures at all 4 points are suppressed. Active dampening tech. Private funding, said the operations officer to his left, who had been on the same intelligence briefings Morimoto had been on. The research group. "Get me a visual on all 4 breach points," Morimoto said. "And get Endeavor to the northern corridor. Now." Endeavor hit the northern corridor at full burn 30 seconds after the alarm activated, and found the first of them already inside. There were 3, that he could see. Tactical gear, no insignia, the kind of equipment that cost more than most pro heroes' entire support budgets. The one in front had a quirk that manifested as a visible energy field around his hands, which he was using to cut through the facility's interior door with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this before. The other 2 flanked him in positions that suggested they'd trained together extensively. None of them were wearing villain masks. None of them were making speeches. They were working, quietly and professionally, which Endeavor had long since learned was considerably more dangerous than the theatrical variety of opposition. "Stop," he said. The word came out wrapped in enough heat to raise the corridor's ambient temperature by 4 degrees, which was a controlled demonstration rather than an attack. "Identify yourselves and your purpose." The one with the energy field quirk looked up from the door without alarm. "Pro Hero Endeavor," he said, in the tone of a man consulting a file he'd memorized. "Current number 1 ranking. Hellflame quirk, maximum output classified but estimated at." He paused, something that might have been respect moving across his face, significant. "Yes." He straightened. "We're not here for conflict with the Commission or its affiliated heroes. We're here for the subject." "The subject," Endeavor repeated. "The Diclonius." The man said the word with the specific familiarity of someone who had a taxonomy for it already. "We've been tracking her evolutionary lineage for 2 years based on theoretical models. Her arrival in this world is a research opportunity that won't occur again." He paused. "We'd prefer to take her cooperatively. We have no interest in harming Commission personnel." Endeavor's fire expanded to fill the corridor. "Not an attack, a wall. A statement of physics. You have 3 seconds to explain who funds your operation before this conversation ends." The man looked at the fire wall with the expression of someone recalculating. 3 seconds is insufficient." Endeavor didn't wait for 3 seconds. The blast was controlled, corridor width, calibrated to disable without killing. The specific level of force he'd spent years learning to modulate, because his early career's approach to modulation had been the thing he regretted most. All three went down, their tactical gear scorched, their consciousness debatable. He was already on his calm, 3 hostiles down, northern corridor. Non-lethal. I need identification runs on all 3 immediately. A pause. And someone tell me where the other breach points are. The answer came back in fragments. Morimoto's voice overlapping with the operations officers, the picture assembling itself from multiple data streams. Breach point 2, 2 operatives, contained by the facility's automated security. Breach point 3, unknown, sensors showing entry but no subsequent movement, which was worse than knowing where they were. Breach point 4. Breach point 4's sensor feed had gone dark. Lucy heard them before the sensors did. The vector that she'd extended through the window into the courtyard had been retracted, but she'd left 3 others running at minimal extension, a meter each, a passive spatial awareness system she'd maintained since childhood, automatic as breathing. One of them registered a pressure change in the ventilation duct above the intake room's ceiling panel that the facility's mechanical systems didn't account for. She was standing in the center of the room when the ceiling panel came down. The operative who dropped through it was good. Fast, silent, the landing absorbed with practiced skill, already moving toward her position before he'd fully straightened. He had a quirk that activated as he moved, his body's edges blurring slightly, a visual distortion that suggested speed or phasing capability. He crossed the distance between the ceiling and Lucy's position in 0.4 seconds. Her vector stopped him at 0.3. Not a cut, she could have cut, and didn't. A hold. The vector pressed flat against his chest with enough force to arrest his momentum completely, leaving him suspended mid. Had been buried. Someone extracted materials from where I came from and brought them here. The operative said nothing. Which means, Lucy said, that someone from this world was in my world. Watching. A pause. Watching what was done to me. To others like me. Her red eyes held his with an intensity that had nothing to do with the vector, which was doing the physical work cleanly and without drama. And they brought that back here. To study. The facility's alarm shifted pitch. Secondary alert, meaning a second breach had been confirmed active inside the building's inner perimeter. Somewhere down the corridor, Endeavor's flames roared against something. Morimoto's voice cut through the overhead comm with clipped, urgent instructions. None of it was as loud as the silence in the intake room. Tell me, Lucy said to the operative held still by her vector, the name of your organization. He told her. It meant nothing to her. This world's naming conventions were still assembling themselves in her understanding. But she filed it with the precision of someone who had learned, early and permanently, that names were power and knowledge was survival. She would find them. Not now, not in this facility with its fake courtyard and its 4-hour legal countdown. But eventually. She lowered the vector. The operative dropped to 1 foot, staggered, straightened. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been released by something that could have made a different choice and hadn't, and was trying to understand what that meant. Go, she said. Tell whoever sent you that I know they exist. Tell them I know about the materials. She held his eyes. And tell them that what was done to me in my world, to all of us, will not be done here. Not by the Commission. Not by them. A pause that had the weight of something irreversible. Tell them that's not a threat. Tell them it's the same thing I told the heroes when I arrived, information. So they understand the situation accurately. He left the way he'd come, through the ceiling, faster than arrival, the panel swinging back into place with a sound that the facility's sensors logged as mechanical rather than human. Lucy stood alone in the intake room and felt, for the first time since the sky had split open above Kamino Ward, something clarify inside her. Not peace. Not resolution. Something more precise than either, purpose. The specific orientation that comes from understanding what you're fighting and why, after a long period of fighting because fighting was all there was. The door burst open. Hawks, moving fast, wings partially deployed, already scanning the room for threat sources. His eyes found her standing in the center of the floor, unhurt, the ceiling panel slightly askew above her. His scan tracked the room. Tracked her. Tracked the ceiling. "What happened?" he said. "Someone came to collect a specimen," Lucy said. "I declined." Hawks looked at the ceiling panel for a long moment. Then back at her. Something moved across his face, complicated, layered, the specific expression of someone who had been worrying about the wrong thing. "Are you?" "I'm not hurt," she said. Then, quieter, "Thank you for asking." He stood in the doorway with his wings half spread and his usual easy expression entirely absent, replaced by something more honest and more tired, and looked at her with the look of a man who had spent his career navigating the distance between institutions and people and was finding that distance, in this moment, unbearable. "We need to move you," he said. "The facility is compromised." "Where?" Lucy asked. He didn't have an answer. She could see that he didn't, which meant he was here without a plan, which meant he'd come because something had overridden the planning instinct, and she knew what that something was because she recognized it from the highway and the interview room and every moment between. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But not here." Lucy looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up nothing because she had nothing to pick up, and walked toward the door. They moved through the facility's Eastern Service corridor with the specific urgency of people who understood that every second in a compromised building was a second the variables were multiplying against them. Hawks led, wings folded tight to navigate the narrow passage, his remaining feathers deployed in a loose perimeter that gave him 360-degree spatial awareness without requiring visual confirmation. Lucy moved behind him with a silence that wasn't practiced. Not the trained quiet of a soldier or a hero, but the bone-deep stillness of someone who had learned early that noise was something that found you before you found it. Her vectors extended in all directions at their full 14 meters, a constant passive map of everything around them that made Hawk's feather sense feel, by comparison, like reading with one eye closed. Endeavor's voice came through the calm in fragments. He was dealing with the second breach team in the facility's western wing, the fight audible even through the encrypted channel, bursts of flame roar and the specific percussion of someone who had stopped modulating and started finishing. 3 down, possibly 4. The third breach point, the one that had gone quiet on the sensors, remained unaccounted for. "Eastern Service exit is 60 meters, Hawk said, low. "Parking structure beyond that." "I have a vehicle." "Morimoto knows you're moving me," Lucy said. "Not a question." "Morimoto knows a lot of things right now," Hawk said. "He's managing 4 simultaneous crises and a legal opinion that just came back telling him what I told him it would tell him. He's occupied." A pause. "He'll be less occupied in about 10 minutes. And then we figure out the next part." Lucy processed this. "You don't have a plan beyond the vehicle." "I have a direction," Hawk said. "Direction is the first part of a plan. That's not how plans work. It's how mine do." They reached a junction, the service corridor intersecting with a wider maintenance passage that ran parallel to the facility's inner security ring. Hawk slowed, feathers reading the space ahead. "Clean." He moved them through. The attack came from above. Not the research group's operatives, their pattern had been ground-level, methodical, resource-heavy. This was faster and stranger, a figure dropping from the maintenance shaft overhead with the specific trajectory of someone who had been waiting rather than pursuing, which meant they'd anticipated the route. Lucy's vectors registered the displacement before Hawk's feathers did, and her response was already in motion before the figure landed, 3 vectors extending to intercept, calibrated for restraint rather than destruction. They caught Dobby mid-drop. He hit the vector field at chest height and stopped, suspended in the corridor with blue flames already igniting across his palms, his scarred face arranged in the expression of someone who had expected resistance but not this particular variety of it. He looked at the empty air holding him with the specific attention of someone trying to identify what they were looking at and not finding it in any category they had. "Invisible," he said. Not alarmed, noting. "Yes," Lucy said, from 3 meters back. "The League sent you," Hawks said, from in front, wings spreading to fill the corridor. "This is Shigaraki's play while the research group has the commission distracted." Dabi's blue flames intensified without spreading, contained, the way Lucy had learned to recognize controlled power. "The League sent me to offer her a way out," he said, eyes moving past Hawks to Lucy with the specific quality of attention that wasn't recruitment and wasn't threat, but something in between that she didn't have a clean name for yet. "Shigaraki wants to talk." "Shigaraki wants to use me," Lucy said. "Yeah," Dabi said, with the flat honesty of someone who had stopped performing his organization's talking points and hadn't yet decided what to replace them with. "He does." His eyes held hers. "Doesn't mean the exit isn't real." "Where's Toga?" Hawk said. "Perimeter. Waiting." "A beat. We're not here to fight. If we were, I'd have hit the facility from the west while Endeavor was occupied." He paused. "That's a separate exit." Lucy looked at him with the same assessing flatness she'd given everyone since arrival, reading the architecture of this the way she read everything, for what was real underneath what was being performed. Dabi was performing very little, which was either authenticity or a more sophisticated manipulation than she'd encountered yet. The flames across his palms were real. The damage written across his skin was real. The specific quality of his detachment. Not Shigaraki's ideology, not the League's collective purpose, but something more personal and more corrosive, was real in the way things are real when they've been carried too long. "You're not here because Shigaraki sent you," she said. Something shifted in Dabi's expression. Microscopic. The vector holding him registered it as a change in his breathing pattern before his face confirmed it. "I'm here because Shigaraki sent me," he said carefully. "And also because you wanted to see what I'd do," Lucy said. "With the choice." The maintenance corridor was very quiet. Hawks was watching the exchange with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they mostly understood. "Toga said you knew she was using the recognition play," Dabi said finally. "And you went with the commission anyway." He studied her. "I wanted to know what that looked like. Someone who sees the manipulation clearly and makes a choice anyway." "Why?" The question landed somewhere in him that he hadn't expected it to land. She watched it happen, watched the detachment slip for just a moment, the distance collapse slightly, revealing something underneath that was angrier and rawer and considerably more alive than the performance suggested. "Because I haven't done that in a long time," he said. "Made a choice that was actually mine." The calm in Hawk's ear crackled, Morimoto, sharp, directive, the occupied man becoming the less occupied man ahead of schedule. "Hawks. Where are you?" Hawks looked at Lucy. Lucy looked at Dabi. Dabi's blue flames had died down to almost nothing. She lowered the vector. Dabi dropped to the floor, caught himself, straightened. He looked at her with the expression of the operative in the intake room, released by something that could have made a different choice, but different in quality. The operative had been afraid of losing data. Dabi looked like he was afraid of something considerably more personal. "Tell Shigaraki I'm not a weapon," Lucy said. "Tell him the commission couldn't contain me and neither could his operation. Tell him that if he wants to talk. Actually talk, not recruit, not leverage, not use, I'll decide then." She paused. "And tell Toga that she was right." It became a room. Dabi looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "Leave," she said. Simply. The way simple things are simple when everything complicated has been stripped away by enough pressure. "Figure out what this world is. Figure out how I got here." A pause. Figure out if there's a way back. And if there isn't? Lucy was quiet for 3 seconds. Then figure out what comes next. Dobby nodded once. Then he looked at Hawks with the expression of a villain acknowledging a hero in the specific register that means neither of them is going to mention this happened. The eastern exit is clear, he said. Research group pulled their perimeter when Endeavor finished with the western team. He paused. You've got maybe 6 minutes before the commission reseals the zone. He left through the maintenance shaft he'd come from, pulling himself up with the ease of someone who had mapped the route in advance, and the corridor was quiet again. Hawks looked at the empty shaft. Then at Lucy. You let him go. Yes. Morimoto is going to. I know. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he started moving again, toward the eastern exit, and Lucy fell into step behind him. For what it's worth, he said, as they moved, I think that was right. It wasn't about right, Lucy said. It was about what was real. A pause. He told me something true. Without being asked. They hit the eastern exit at a run, the door pressure sealed from the inside, Hawk's feathers working the manual override while Lucy's vectors held the frame against the structural damage the breach teams had done to the surrounding wall. The door gave. Night air hit them. Cool, salt-edged, the Tokyo exurban dark broken by facility lights and the distant glow of the city. The parking structure was 30 meters across open ground. They covered it fast. Hawks had the vehicle running before Lucy had the door closed, and they were out of the structure before Morimoto's resealing order hit the facility's automated systems. On the comm, which he'd switched to receive only, Morimoto's voice ran through containment protocols, breach assessments, personnel accounting. The name Hawks came up twice with a tone that communicated the conversation that was waiting on the other end of it. They drove in silence for 4 minutes. Lucy watched the facility's lights disappear behind them in the side mirror with the expression of someone watching something they'd expected to see end. The research group, she said finally. The materials they had from my world. We'll find them, Hawks said. I'll find them, Lucy said. Not correction, distinction. Something personal that wasn't transferable. He glanced at her. Not alone. She looked at him with those red eyes in the dark of the moving vehicle, and something moved across her face that had no precedent in anything she'd shown anyone since the highway. Not the bedrock shift of Endeavor's interview room, not the fine-line crack of Toga's recognition, not the clarified purpose of the intake room. Something newer and more uncertain than any of those. The expression of someone encountering an idea they don't have armor for yet because they've never needed armor for it before. Someone offering to stay. We'll see, she said. It wasn't yes. But it wasn't the flat, armored, calcified not answer she'd been giving everything since she arrived. It was something that acknowledged the offer as real, as something worth responding to rather than cataloging and filing under manipulation or management or things people say before the room. Hawks drove. Lucy watched the dark between the city lights with the specific attention of someone mapping new territory. Behind them, Response Architecture 7's alarm system cycled through its breach protocols, and in the facility's operations center, Morimoto stood in front of his monitors with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man assembling a revised understanding of a situation he thought he had contained. On his desk, Dr. Sato's genetic report sat beside the Commission's legal opinion beside the breach team's identification files beside the intelligence intercept flagging the research group's name, which he was cross-referencing now with 3 years of monitored communications. The materials they'd brought from another world. The theoretical models built on data extracted from places and people and things done in rooms that no oversight body had ever reviewed. He picked up his secure comm. Made a call that wasn't to his legal counsel or his operations team. A call to the kind of number that existed in the Commission's infrastructure for the specific purpose of things. That couldn't be addressed through standard channels. The line connected. We have a situation, Morimoto said. Multiple situations, actually. They're connected. A pause. I need everything we have on the research group. Everything. And I need to know who authorized the initial cross-dimensional extraction. Another pause, longer, while the voice on the other end said something. No, Morimoto said. Not for containment. Something had shifted in his voice. Small, almost imperceptible, but Hawks would have recognized it from the highway as the sound a person makes when they've moved from managing a situation to genuinely reckoning with it. For accountability. He ended the call and stood for a moment in the operations center's quiet. On the monitor, the eastern exit door hung open to the dark, and the parking structure beyond it was empty. 3 weeks after Response Architecture 7, Tokyo looked the same. This was the thing about cities, Lucy had learned, they absorbed events that should have changed them and continued their surface unchanged, the way water closes over a stone. The Kamino Ward Highway had been repaired within 48 hours, the scored asphalt replaced, the guardrail sections quietly swapped out by a commission maintenance crew whose work order described the damage as vehicle impact. The news coverage had lasted 6 days before the Commission's press office found the specific combination of official statements and strategic information releases that moved the story from front page to background noise. She knew this because Hawks told her. He'd been telling her things. Regularly, without being asked, without framing it as management or intelligence or the careful parceling out of information that characterized every other relationship she'd had with people who had institutional backing. Just, things he thought she should know, delivered with the same directness he'd deployed since the highway. She was still deciding what to do with that. The apartment was in Mizutafu, 3rd floor, registered under a name that Morimoto had provided through channels that didn't officially exist. This was the Commission's compromise position, the one that Hawks had negotiated over 3 days of conversations that Lucy hadn't been present for but had been informed of in full afterward, which was itself a change from every previous experience she had with institutions negotiating about her. Temporary residency documentation. A registered identity that placed her as a foreign national with unusual biological characteristics attributable to a quirk, the legal fiction that Dr. Sato's genetic report had made simultaneously necessary and complicated. Monthly check-ins with a commission liaison who had been specifically selected because she was, in Hawk's assessment, the least likely person in the commission to look at Lucy and see a resource. No room. No facility. No observation glass. She stood at the apartment window in the early morning, watching the street below with the passive vector awareness she'd maintained since childhood, and thought about the specific distance between what she'd expected and what had happened. It wasn't trust. She wasn't capable of trust in the way the word usually meant. The unguarded, unreserved extension of faith that people who hadn't been where she'd been managed with an ease she found genuinely difficult to comprehend. But there was something adjacent to it that had begun to form in the 3 weeks since the facility, something that lived in the space between the armor and the world, thin and new and more fragile than anything she'd carried in a long time. Izuku Midoriya had come to see her on day 9. She hadn't expected that. Hawks had mentioned him. The student who'd researched her psychology, who'd attempted contact during the chaos of the facility breach before the situation had escalated past the point where that approach was viable. He'd shown up at the apartment door with a notebook that had Lucy written on the cover tab in the specific handwriting of someone who wrote notes about everything as a reflex, and an expression of such genuine, unperformed earnestness that her first instinct had been to look past him for the angle. There hadn't been an angle. That had taken her most of the visit to accept. He'd sat across from her at the apartment's small table and asked questions, not about her vectors, not about her biology, not about the breach or the research group or the Commission's containment protocols. About her world. What it had been like. What she'd wanted, before the facility and the experiments and the long series of rooms that had shaped her into what she was. He'd listened with the specific quality of attention that didn't perform interest but simply had it. And when she told him, carefully, in the abbreviated version she'd assembled for situations where full disclosure served no purpose, he'd been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. Not as a diplomatic gesture. Not as a tactical empathy deployment. Just the words, plainly, with the weight of someone who meant them and didn't know what else to do with them. She'd found, to her considerable surprise, that she didn't have a response prepared for that. Every system she'd built for managing people's reactions to what she was had assumed the reactions would be fear, desire for control, or performance of compassion in service of some other goal. Midoriya's response fit none of those categories, and the absence of a category had left her briefly, cleanly without armor. She'd told him more than she'd planned to. She was still thinking about that. The research group had a name. Axiom Biological Sciences, private funding traced through 4 shell structures before it ran into the specific institutional opacity that meant government adjacent without government accountability. Morimoto's investigation was ongoing, which Hawks reported with the careful honesty of someone who knew ongoing could mean many things. 2 of the operatives from the facility breach were cooperating with Commission inquiry. The one Lucy had released from the intake room was not. The cross-dimensional extraction was 3 years old, authorized by someone whose name hadn't surfaced yet in the document trail. Materials had crossed over, research documentation, genetic profiles, experimental results from a world that looked enough like Lucy's that the taxonomy matched. Someone from this dimensional stream had been present in her world, or a world like it, as an observer. Had watched. Had taken notes. Had brought those notes back and built a scientific program on them. The specific nausea this produced in her was clean and informative. She'd had 3 weeks to sit with it, and what it had clarified was not rage. Rage was too simple, too consuming, too likely to flatten the distinction between the people who had done this and the people who hadn't known. What it had clarified was purpose. The specific, oriented, sustainable thing she'd felt in the intake room when the operative had told her the organization's name, extended now into something with more shape and more duration. She would find who had authorized the extraction. She would find what else they had. She would make certain that what had been done, in her world, to people like her, did not become a template for what could be done here. Not with the Commission's authorization. Not under Starfleet's mandate. That was a different universe's framework, and she caught the category error immediately, replacing it with, not under Hero Society's bureaucratic limits. On her own terms, with whatever alliances proved real rather than managed. Hawks had said not alone in the parking structure, in the dark, driving away from a compromised facility. She was still deciding about that too. On the 22nd day, she went to UA. Not officially. Not through the channels Hawks had mentioned, the ones that would have involved Commission approval and Morimoto's sign-off and the specific institutional choreography of an organization that was still deciding whether she was a person or a precedent. She went because Midoriya had left his notebook on the apartment table, deliberately, she was nearly certain, in the specific way people leave things when they want to create a reason to return, and returning it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. She walked through the UA campus in the morning quiet before classes, vectors at minimal extension, mapping the space with the automatic thoroughness that would never fully turn off. The school was large, purposeful, built for the specific project of making young people into something useful for the world. A project she had complicated feelings about, given her history with institutions that had similar ambitions about people with unusual capabilities. But the students she passed in the corridors were different from anything she'd encountered in a facility. Loud, messy, arguing about homework and hero rankings and the specific social catastrophes of people who were 17 and hadn't yet learned to hide what they cared about. They looked at her horns with the open curiosity of a generation for whom unusual physical characteristics were simply the visible expression of quirks, and the looking was different, the opposite of clinical, the opposite of the observation glass quality she'd spent her life being subjected to. A girl with pink skin and black and yellow eyes looked at her horns and said, "Oh, those are so cool, what's your quirk?" Lucy had stood in the corridor for 2 seconds, processing a reaction she hadn't anticipated to a question she'd never been asked in that register before. "Vectors," she'd said. "Amazing, the girl had said, already moving, already past her, already on to the next thing in the specific momentum of someone whose day was too full for extended pauses. Lucy had watched her go. Then she'd found Midoriya's classroom, left the notebook with the student at the door who'd taken it with the cheerful reliability of someone used to performing that function, and walked back out through the UA gates into the morning. She stood on the street outside and felt the city around her, the vectors reading it passively, the traffic and the people and the buildings and the distance to the horizon. And thought about the girl with the pink skin and the question asked without fear, without calculation, without anything except the ordinary human curiosity of someone encountering something they hadn't seen before. What's your quirk? Not what are you? Not what can you do for us? Not how do we contain this? Just, what is the thing that makes you specifically you? She didn't have an answer that fit the question's frame. Her vectors weren't a quirk, they were a biological organ system, as natural to her as lungs, and she was not a quirk carrier but a separate evolutionary development in a world that had organized its entire social taxonomy around a concept she didn't fit. She was, in this world as in her own, a category that the existing categories didn't account for. But the question had been asked without malice, without agenda, without the clinical distance of someone holding a clipboard. And something about that, small, specific, insufficient on its own but real in a way that small true things are real, lodged in the space between the armor and the world and stayed there. She began walking. No destination yet. Direction first, which was not how plans worked, except that it was how hers did, now, in this world that was not her own and might never fully be. Behind her, the UA gates stood open to whoever was coming next. The Commission's investigation into Axiom Biological Sciences would take 14 months and result in the dissolution of 3 shell organizations, the suspension of 2 senior Commission officials, and a formal inquiry into cross-dimensional research ethics that the Hero Public Safety Commission had not previously acknowledged as a category requiring guidelines. Morimoto would testify twice. Dar. Sato's genetic report would become the foundational document in a legal framework that didn't yet have a name. Hawks would check in every 3 days. Not officially. Just, things he thought she should know. Endeavor would say nothing for 6 weeks, and then show up at the apartment with 2 cups of coffee and the specific expression of a man who has something to say and hasn't decided how yet. They would sit at the small table for an hour. He would leave without having said it. He would come back. Toga would send a message through a channel that Lucy wasn't supposed to have access to and that Hawks pretended not to know about. The message would say, "Told you." Lucy would not respond. She would read it 4 times. Dobby would not make contact. This was, Lucy understood, its own kind of contact. And somewhere in the infrastructure of a world that was learning, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable institutional resistance, that its existing categories were insufficient. A girl with horns and invisible arms walked through the morning and mapped the distance between what she'd survived and what might, given enough time and enough of the small true things, become something else. Something without a clean name yet. Something like beginning. In the end, Lucy arrived in a world built on the premise that power defines purpose, that what you can do determines what you are, and what you are determines where you belong. Hero society had a taxonomy for this, heroes and villains, quirks and their users, the registered and the unregistered, the contained and the free. It was a system that had produced extraordinary people and extraordinary damage in roughly equal measure, and it had no category for someone like her. That absence of category, which had been the source of everything done to her, turned out to be the only thing that gave her genuine freedom. She couldn't be filed. She couldn't be registered. She couldn't be fully managed by Morimoto's institutional frameworks or fully weaponized by Shigaraki's ideological ones or fully reached by Midoriya's earnest, notebook-carrying hope. She existed in the space between all of their systems, which was uncomfortable and uncertain and the first time in her life that the space she occupied had been chosen rather than assigned. Hero society would remember Lucy not as a villain or a hero but as a question it hadn't thought to ask itself, what do you do with someone your categories can't contain? The answer it eventually arrived at was imperfect and partial and took considerably longer than it should have. But it was an answer. And Lucy, who had spent her life being answered before she'd been asked, found that insufficient and real and, in the specific way that true things are sometimes also enough, something she could work with. Live long and prosper. More stories await.